Throughout history there have been many different women who were dragged to execution platforms to meet their demises on a gallows or by axe or other means. Some of the most infamous include Anne Boleyn, a queen whose downfall was plotted by her husband Henry VIII. But lots of other women were executed in different ways. For example, Fanny Kaplan, who shot Vladimir Lenin, was ruthlessly shot herself, and then her remains were burned inside of a barrel. There was also lots of women who were taken to the guillotine inside of France, and in England mostly they were either hanged on a gallows or they were burned at the stake in front of a large amount of people. During Henry VIII's reign there was even one woman who was boiled alive inside of a pot for poisoning the women she worked for. In this documentary we look at the execution of many women who throughout history met horrific ends. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Mary Jenkins met John Harrison Surratt in 1839 and the couple would marry. John purchased a huge amount of land from his adoptive father, and the couple and their children would move back at some point to the District of Columbia to help John's mother run a farm. Mary Surratt became involved in raising funds to build a church, but her husband was not happy with his wife's religious activities. His behaviour would get worse over time, as he drank heavier and failed to pay his debts, but also he had a temper that grew violent, and he took this out on Mary. The family's business enterprises would expand over time, and they would buy land around a tavern and name it Surrattsville, and the settlement had a post office, forge, and around a dozen houses. The American Civil War broke out on April 12, 1861, and the tavern hosted many Confederate sympathisers. But Mary's tavern became a safe house for Confederate spies, and the activities around their land attracted attention from the Union government. Around 300 soldiers camped there and investigated the Surratts' Confederate activities. John Surratt would die around August 25, 1862, and the family were in financial problems. Mary found her husband's unpaid debts, and several of her slaves ran away, and Mary was tired of running the farm, tavern, and other businesses without her son's help, and she contemplated moving to her townhouse in the city. She took possession of this in October 1864, and it had 4 stories, and she leased out her tavern, and she then advertised for lodgers in a newspaper. However, Louis J. Weichman would move into Surratt's boarding house on the 1st of November 1863, and then John Surratt Jr. was introduced to John Wilkes Booth, the man who would assassinate Lincoln. John Jr. was recruited into the conspiracy to kidnap Lincoln, and Confederate agents then began to come to Mary's boarding house a lot. George Atzerodt and Lewis Powell would board at her townhouse for some time, and these became co-conspirators in the plot to kill Lincoln. Atzerodt visited the house a number of times, and he was even evicted by Mary as he was such a heavy drinker, but he continued to frequent the house. David Herold, another conspirator, also visited there a number of times, but as part of the plot to kidnap or kill Lincoln, 2 rifles, ammunition and supplies were stored at the Surratt Tavern. On the 11th of April, Mary rented a carriage and drove to the tavern, and she went to collect her debt, but she may have also gone to get the weapons to be used in the killing. Booth would also visit the boarding house, and he gave Mary a package with binoculars in them. Booth's plan was to assassinate Lincoln and have Atzerodt kill the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and for Powell to kill Secretary of State, William H. Seward. Booth managed to kill Lincoln. Atzerodt never attempted to kill Johnson, but Powell stabbed Seward and he survived. As they fled the city, they picked up rifles and the binoculars from Surratt's tavern. But at 2 a.m. on the 15th of April 1865, members of the police force visited the Surratt boarding house looking for Wilkes Booth and John Surratt. They may have been alerted to Confederate activity there, but within 45 minutes of the attack, John Surratt's name was linked. A neighbour would tell the army that 3 men had come to Mary's house on the night of the assassination, and that one had mentioned Booth in a theatre. Federal soldiers visited the house again, and they would find in Mary's room a picture of Booth, and also a pistol and a mould for making bullets. Mary was arrested, and she was then held in the annex of the old Capitol prison before she was transferred to the Washington Arsenal. Armed guards watched her cell, and her cell was airy and bigger than others, and food was served for her 4 times a day. Mary was kept well compared to the others, who were sat in padded canvas bags to prevent them taking their own lives. Others wore manacles, but Mary was not shackled, and she was allowed visits from her daughter. A military tribunal was chosen as a venue for the trials, and all 8 conspirators were tried simultaneously. Mary was allowed a bonnet, fan and veil to hide her face, and she was ill during her trial. She was charged with aiding, abetting, concealing and harbouring her co-defendants. It was clear that the conspirators met inside her boarding house, and this was confirmed by a number of witnesses. The defence claimed that the other defendants came to the house without Mary knowing what was going on, and when the trial ended, Mary Surratt was so ill that she had to stay in her cell. However, she was found guilty and was sentenced to death, despite being very ill, and she was the only woman linked to the conspiracy. A death sentence was passed, and the night before her execution, Surratt's priest and her daughter came to visit Powell and asked him to try and save Mary's life. But this would not happen, and there were more pleas for her life. Construction of the gallows for the hanging of the conspirators began on the 5th of July, after the execution order had been signed. It was made in the south part of the Arsenal courtyard. It was 12 feet high and 20 feet square in its size. The nooses were made, and the man who made them made Mary's noose the night before the execution, with 5 loops rather than the regulation 7, as he thought the government would never hang a woman. The nooses were tested and they held out, and soldiers were forced to dig the graves. At noon on the 6th of July, Mary was told she would be hanged the next day, and she wept a great deal. The priest remained with her until the next day, and she was still in great pain. Her daughter even went to the White House to beg for her mother's life, and this was rejected again. At 11:25 a.m, further tests of the gallows continued, and before noon Mary was taken from her cell, and she was sat on a chair near to the entrance of the courtyard. It was a very hot day, and at 1:15 p.m, on the 7th of July 1865, the 4 condemned prisoners were escorted up the steps. Each prisoner's ankles and wrists were bound, and Mary Surratt led the way. Over 1,000 people were there to watch, and also family members looked on. The order for the execution was read, and Mary, weak from illness or swooning in fear, had to be held up by 2 soldiers and her priest. The condemned were in chairs and Mary collapsed into hers. White cloth bound her arms to the sides and her ankles and thighs together, and from the scaffold Powell said, "Mrs. Surratt is innocent. She doesn't deserve to die with the rest of us." 2 priests held a crucifix to her lips, and a white bag was then placed over her head. The noose was secured, and Surratt's bonnet was taken off as the noose was placed over her neck. She complained that the bindings hurt her arms, and then the prisoners were asked to move forward towards the nooses. Chairs were taken away, and her last words were, "Please don't let me fall." Surratt stood on the drop for around 10 seconds, then the captain clapped his hands. 4 soldiers knocked out the supports and the condemned fell. Mary had moved forward enough to barely step on the drop, and her body snapped tight at the end of the rope and swung back and forth, and she died quickly with little struggle. Mary's body was inspected by a doctor and was left to hang for 30 minutes before it was cut down. Her body was cut down at 1:59 p.m, and as she was cut down her head fell forward. Mary Surratt was a woman who owned a boarding house where the members of the Lincoln conspiracy would meet and plan their actions. Many believed she was innocent and should not have been killed, but she was a woman who, despite this, would have known intricately about the plan to assassinate Lincoln. Incriminating evidence was found in her quarters at the boarding house, but she was very weak and ill when she was executed, and in her final days she suffered a great deal. Germaine Leloy Godefroy was born on the 18th of May 1917 inside of France, and she would work as a young woman as a coal merchant from Bayeux. She married Albert Leloy, and the pair would work together on their family business. But her victim would be her husband. However, it's believed that Germaine Godefroy had fallen in love with another man, who was slightly younger than her, and he was a clerk of their coal business, and with this, Germaine then planned to murder her husband, and then run the business with her lover. 5 days before the murder, she asked her lover to sharpen an axe, and also shorten its handle, meaning it would be easier for her to swing. She then hid this in a pile of wood, and she brought this into her house, and she then hid the axe yet again inside of a crate, waiting for the moment that she would strike, killing her husband. On the 10th of December 1947, in the evening, around 7 p.m, Germaine gave her lover all of the savings that she had, around 82,000 francs. She said to him, "Hide it, I will say that I was robbed." She then entered the family home. She was planning to disguise the crime as a random robbery, which had gone terribly wrong. Germaine wielded the axe, and shortly after speaking with her lover, she carried out the brutal attack and murder of her husband. Her husband was instantly killed with the onslaught, and she smashed him twice on the head whilst he slept with the axe, and the crime was incredibly brutal. Very soon after, her husband's body was discovered, and with this Germaine and her lover Raymond were caught and were arrested. But it would be a very different axe that would fall upon Germaine Godefroy. The pair were both brought to trial, and Raymond received a prison sentence of 10 years, but Germaine would not be so lucky, and she was sentenced to death, as she was considered the mastermind, and she was the one, ultimately, that carried out the attack. She was then transported to Angers prison to await her death date with the guillotine, and also the executioner. She would be executed by an executioner with the nickname the Man from Paris. Regional executioners had been abolished in the centuries before, but then there was only one chief executioner, and he was ordered to live in the French capital. Because of this, the executioner, Jules Henri Desfourneaux, was summoned from Paris, and he had a long history of being a headsman, and also his family had been executioners. Some executioners were despised by the French population, but they did not mind coming to watch the proceedings and the execution, like in the medieval times, but they certainly did not want to be friends with someone who took the life of another person or an executioner. Jules Henri Desfourneaux had executed dozens of people throughout the years, but Germaine Leloy Godefroy would be the last woman who was executed by guillotine in France. The executioner would also be the man that performed the last public execution in France, with the German serial killer Eugène Wiedemann being strapped to the device, and the wooden board before the blade was released. At the time, in public, a lot of the audience would behave shockingly when watching an execution, and they would take photographs of the proceedings, and also they would become rather riotous. Because of this, executions in public at the time were banned, and this stopped the centuries' tradition of public execution in France. Germaine Leloy Godefroy asked for clemency following her death sentence, but this was not granted. Germaine knew the end was coming, and she was not informed that she would die until it was time to take her final walk to the execution chamber. At 4:30 a.m. on the 21st of April 1949, Germaine Leloy Godefroy's time was up. The ageing executioner was ready to perform the final execution of a woman in France on the guillotine. Germaine spoke with a priest, and she attended Mass before writing one final letter, and she then underwent the toilette de condamned. This was the ordeal where the hair of the condemned was trimmed and cut, and her neck and clothes were prepared for the blade. Traditionally condemned people, during this, were given a final cigarette and a glass of rum if they wanted it, but Germaine refused this. But the execution would be slightly delayed, as at the time a convict under French law could not be executed. They had to be formally paroled by the justice system in the custody of the executioner. But then amendments to the paperwork were made, and the execution went ahead, and the guillotine was finally prepared. It was said that she turned pale and dressed in silence, helped by the two inmates who shared her cell. Following this, Germaine Godefroy would enter the execution chamber where the guillotine was found. She was then attached to the wooden board, which was then slid under the guillotine blade. The executioner then made a few final checks and preparations before he released the blade, and it fell, taking the head clean off Germaine Godefroy, the brutal murderer who slaughtered her husband with an axe. The guillotine blade fell at 5:50 a.m. just over an hour after she'd been told that she was going to die. Germaine Godefroy was a brutal murderer who became the last woman who was executed on the guillotine in France. Her execution was performed in private inside of a prison, but there had been a number of witnesses who were gathered who were close to her deceased husband, and these men and women would look on as the executioner secured her in place below the blade. Her execution took a matter of seconds, and it was done with ruthless efficiency, and the same efficiency that executed a French king, a French queen, and thousands of other people during the French Revolution. On the 15th of April 1532 at Smithfield in London, near to the meat market, Richard Roos was dragged out to the scaffold where a huge pot sat on top of a fire. He was someone who had been condemned to death, specifically by the King, Henry VIII, as he was said to have been responsible for an attempted poisoning plot against the Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher. During an afternoon meal, there was pandemonium inside Fisher's household, as a meal was poisoned, and this resulted in the deaths of 2 people. Some historians have actually claimed that it was Fisher who was the actual target, and that the king may have been in some way involved in this, or that his second wife, Anne Boleyn, may have been. Fisher had been a staunch supporter of Catherine of Aragon, the king's first wife. With this, Fisher may have encountered an enemy in the monarchy, but Henry VIII himself had a huge fear of poisoning. He would employ a number of food tasters that had to sample his every meal. These were men and women who were practically lambs to the slaughter if a meal had been poisoned. But Henry was very paranoid about impending death. Poisoning had been the method of execution and murder for centuries, even as far back as the ancient times, and the king did not want to become a victim of it. When Richard Roos was arrested, Henry himself addressed Parliament to ensure that this man was put to death swiftly and quickly without any questions asked. It was almost suspicious, and Roos was condemned by an act of attainder. He said in his speech that, His Highness, considering that man's life above all things is chiefly to be favoured, and voluntary murders most highly to be detested and abhorred, and specifically all kinds of murders poisoning, which in this realm, hitherto the Lord, to be thanked, hath been the most rare, and seldom committed or practised. But Henry then came up with the brutal punishment for a poisoner, and this was for someone to be boiled alive. With this he made alterations to the law of his country, and adapted the treason law to include this. It was said that, I quote, the said poisoning be adjudged high treason, and that the said Richard Roos for the said murder and poisoning of the said 2 persons shall stand and be attainted of high treason, and shall be therefore boiled to death without benefit of clergy, and that in future murder by poisoning shall be adjudged high treason, and the offender deprived of his clergy and boiled to death. But Richard Roos's execution specifically could have been symbolic. Was the lowering of him into the boiling pot representative of him pouring poison into the food that was then distributed at Fisher's household, or was Henry VIII having a sick joke with the fact he wanted the cook to be punished by being boiled alive, as if he was the broth being prepared for supper? It's not specifically known, but nevertheless Richard Roos was executed at Smithfield, and he was lowered in and out of a boiling cauldron at least 3 times. Each time he came up he was screaming until he succumbed to his death. It was claimed by those men and women who witnessed the execution that he roared mighty loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead, and other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. Boiling as an execution method in England did not really catch on too much. It was reserved specifically for those people who were condemned to death for the crime of poisoning. Those condemned for treason were still dragged to Tyburn, where they were hanged, drawn and quartered, and heads were still being taken off on Tower Hill. But boiling was only really used on 2 recorded occasions, and the other account of this punishment was equally as harrowing and terrifying. During the reign of King Henry VIII, there was a woman inside of London who was boiled alive. She was subjected to the same fate as Richard Roos, in exactly the same spot, and who knows, they may have even used the same pot to boil her. Margaret Davy was a woman who worked inside the household of a mistress, and she was by all accounts a servant who served a number of others. She was a lowly woman, and when accused of a terrible crime, She was actually an easy target for people to pick on and then throw the book at. Treason during the Tudor times also included the idea of a servant murdering their master or mistress, or a woman murdering her husband, as this was seen as an attack on social hierarchy and status. But Margaret Davy was, in 1542, dragged to Smithfield for her execution. It was claimed in historical documents about her crimes that to kill a man by poison is the most detestable of all, because it is most horrible and fearful to the nature of man, and of all others can be at least prevented, either by manhood or providence. This offence was so odious that by an act of Parliament it was made high treason, and it inflicted a more grievous and lingering death than the common law prescribed, viz., that the offender shall be boiled to death in hot water. Upon the statute, Margaret Davy, a young woman, was attainted of high treason for poisoning her mistress, and some others, was boiled to death in Smithfield the 17th of March in the same year. Seemingly, Margaret Davy had been condemned for being involved in a poisoning plot like Roos had, but this time she was accused of poisoning 3 people in the home where she lived and stayed. One of these women targeted was her mistress, who employed her and ensured she had a roof over her head. This was seen as a terrible crime and attack, and with this Margaret Davy in 1542 was taken to Smithfield for her execution. It's not known that day how many people came to witness her killing, but it's probable that thousands were there. Executions at Smithfield tended to coincide with market day to ensure that so many people were around to see a killing method that would put any other people off committing the offence of some sort. Because of the brutality of a boiling alive, the method of execution was also chosen, as it was said to have been one of the most harrowing, and people would hear about this and then think twice about poisoning their masters or others. It was easy for servants to do this, as they were the ones who prepared the food, and the boiling of people was a strong deterrent against this. But boiling alive as a punishment method did not last long, as during the reign of King Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, the treason laws and rules developed by Henry were repealed, and were changed quietly to ensure this did not happen again. There were only really 2 accounts of boiling alive during Henry VIII's reign, Richard Roos and Margaret Davy, and both were condemned for the same sort of crime. Margaret Davy's life is one which is mostly considered secret and lost to the history books, but her crime is known, as is the brutality of her execution, but little in between exists. She may have just been a young woman when she was executed by literally being lowered in and out of a boiling pot until she was left inside to smoulder. Sophia was born in St. Petersburg, and her family were rather wealthy and were aristocrats. The family were descendants of Elizabeth of Russia through marriage, and Sophia's father was a military governor of St. Petersburg. She spent her early life in the Crimea, and she was not the most well-educated, but Sophia taught herself to read, and she then lost herself in books. But the family then moved to St. Petersburg, and she went to a school, and whilst there she became close with a number of girls who were interested in the radical movement. Sophia Perovskaya, at the age of 16, then left home as her father was not happy with her friends and their political beliefs and ideas. But she then became part of a revolutionary society, the Circle of Tchaikovsky. She then went to work in different areas, but she became a teacher and also a medical assistant. She was described as, in her moral conceptions, she was a vigorist, but not in the least of the sermon preaching type. Perovskaya was a populist to the very bottom of her heart, and at the same time a revolutionist, a fighter of the truest steel. She said to me once, "We have begun a great thing. 2 generations perhaps will succumb in the task, and yet it must be done." She then occupied a number of apartments in St. Petersburg, where revolutionaries and rebels would meet up. They did this in Sophia's apartments in secret, but in 1874 she was arrested and was imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress. But she was then acquitted after being imprisoned for a number of years. But then in 1878 she was arrested yet again and was banished to the Olonets Governorate. But she then managed to escape as she was sent to exile, and she went undercover trying to avoid capture. She was a member of a terrorist group, but Sophia Perovskaya went to Kharkov. She tried to organise the freeing of political prisoners from the prison there. She continued to get involved in different rebel actions, and she also took part in speeches and creative propaganda to distribute amongst soldiers and students. But then in November 1879, she was involved in an attempt to blow up the imperial train as it travelled from St. Petersburg to Moscow, but this attempt failed. But Sophia would not stop in her attempts to assassinate. Sophia Perovskaya took part in the planning and preparation for the assassination attempts of Alexander II of Russia. The emperor near to Moscow in 1879, and then in Odessa the following year, was targeted. However, she was then involved in the assassination attempt in St. Petersburg that killed him on the 1st of March 1881. The emperor every Sunday went to participate in military roll call, and he then had done this for a number of years. The emperor's carriage was followed by 2 sleighs, carrying the chief of police and the chief of his guard staff. The route passed via the Catherine Canal, and the streets were lined with members of the public. One of the assassins then threw a white package which was wrapped in a handkerchief. He later said, "After a moment's hesitation I threw the bomb. I sent it under the horse's hooves, in the supposition that it would blow up under the carriage. The explosion knocked me into the fence." The explosion had only damaged the bulletproof carriage of Alexander II, and he was shaken up but was not hurt. However, a second member of the Narodnaya Volya, who was stood by the fence, threw something at the emperor's feet. It was then said, "I was deafened by the new explosion, burned, wounded, and thrown to the ground. Suddenly, amid the smoke and snowy fog, I heard His Majesty's weak voice crying, 'Help!' Gathering what strength I saw, I jumped up and rushed to the emperor. His Majesty was half lying, half sitting, leaning on his right arm. Thinking he was merely wounded heavily, I tried to lift him, but the Tsar's legs were shattered, and the blood poured out of them. 20 people with wounds of varying degrees lay on the sidewalk and on the street. Some managed to stand, others to crawl, still others tried to get out from underneath the bodies that had fallen on them. Through the snow, debris, and blood, you could see fragments of clothing, epaulets, sabres, and bloody chunks of human flesh. The bomb caused chaos, and Alexander, who was bleeding to death, had his legs torn to pieces, and his stomach was torn open, and his face was mutilated badly. He was then taken away to the Winter Palace, but then within 15 minutes or so he died. Sophia Perovskaya was the closest friend of the wife of a member of the committee of the assassins, and was key in directing the bomb plot, and with this she was linked to them. The night before the attack, Sophia had also helped to build the bombs and the weapons. She had a key involvement in the assassination, as she gave a signal to the assassins to carry out the attack, and she was the one who gave the signal to attack when the first bomb was thrown. One of the assassins, Nikolai Rysakov, who threw the bomb under the Tsar's carriage, would turn across to the authorities, and he was cooperative with the investigators. He gave testimony telling of the other participants, and the Tsarist police arrested Sophia and the others. Shortly before her trial she wrote to her mother saying, "My darling, I implore you to be calm and not to grieve for me, for my fate does not afflict me in the least, and I shall meet it with complete tranquillity, for I have long expected it, and known that sooner or later it must come. I have lived as my convictions dictated, and it would have been impossible for me to have acted otherwise." Sophia Perovskaya was then tried by the special tribunal of the ruling Senate, and she was then sentenced to death by hanging. She was the first woman in Russia who was sentenced to death for taking part in terrorism. But on the morning of the 15th of April, the prisoners, including Sophia, were taken to the parade ground of the Semyonovsky Regiment, where their execution would occur. They were all dressed in black prison uniforms, and on their chests read a placard that said regicide. Sophia Perovskaya was put in a cart and was drawn through the city by horses, and it was said that 100,000 people came to watch her executions. They were taken to the gallows, and they were then led up the stairs of the gallows. Priests then administered the last rites, and the assassins were greeted by them, and they kissed the crucifix. As the priests left, the assassins bid each other farewell, but Sophia would not go near the man who told of them. Along with 4 others, Sophia Perovskaya was then hanged on a large gallows at the same time. Sophia Perovskaya was an assassin who was a mastermind behind the assassination and death of the Russian emperor. She was a woman who helped to build the bombs involved in the plot, but despite coming from noble roots, she was an anarchic character who wanted to change Russia. But ultimately she was sentenced to death for her actions, and along with the other co-conspirators, she was executed on the gallows. Martha Place was born on the 18th of September 1849 in New Jersey. It's believed she had a rather normal upbringing, but when she was 23 she was hit in the head by a sleigh, and this had a devastating impact on her life. It was said by her brother that she never recovered from this accident, and that it affected her mental state, leaving her rather unstable. She lived in New Jersey, and for work she plied her trade as a dressmaker. But she then married a man named Wesley Salvacle, but she left him following giving birth to their son. Martha had to then give her son up for adoption, as she was struggling financially, and she relocated to New York in 1893, and she worked as a housekeeper for a man called William W. Place in Brooklyn. The couple struck up a relationship and married later that year, but then she got another housekeeper, and Martha was now living comfortably with her husband. Her second husband William had a daughter from a previous marriage, but it was believed that Martha was very jealous of Ida, as she had William's affections over her at times, and William rang the police a number of times after his wife threatened to murder Ida, his daughter. But she would go further and would eventually commit horrific crimes against the Place family. In the night of the 7th of February 1898, Martha snapped. William arrived home that night, and he was then attacked by Martha, who held an axe in her hand. William, her husband, managed to escape somehow, and then he ran for help. He managed to track down the police, and when they got back, they found Martha lying close to death. She was on the floor with clothes over her head, and gas from burners in the room was escaping. She may have been trying to gas herself or blow up the house. When the police sorted this, they went upstairs and they found Ida Place, Martha's stepdaughter, lying on the bed with blood coming out of her mouth. She had acid thrown in her eyes, which had been taken from William's study, as he used acid in his work as an amateur photographer. It was found that the murderer had then strangled Ida, the young 17-year-old daughter, but the prime suspect was Martha Place. Despite being in hospital, she was arrested on suspicion of murder. She was placed on trial, and she said in the court that she was innocent and had not committed the murder of her stepdaughter. But a witness said that she is rather tall and spare, with a pale, sharp face. Her nose is long and pointed, her chin sharp and prominent, her lips thin and her forehead retreating. There is something about her face that reminds one of a rat's, and the bright but changeless eyes somehow strengthen the impression. But despite this, she was found guilty of the murder of her stepdaughter and was then sentenced to death. One of the key witnesses who testified against her was her husband William, who believed she was evil and believed she was the one who murdered Ida. He had mentioned the threats against Ida's life that Martha had made previously. But the method of execution which was planned for her was one which was considered at the time rudimentary and rather untested against a woman. The governor of the state of New York at the time was Theodore Roosevelt, and he was asked to commute Martha's death sentence. However, ultimately he refused to do this, as he saw her crime as heinous. But the electric chair was the execution method scheduled for Martha M. Place, and at the time there had never been a woman who had been executed in this manner. Because of this and the position of the electrodes, the executioner had to come up with a different way of executing her than they would men who would face this punishment. On the 20th of March 1899, inside of Sing Sing prison, Martha M. Place was brought into the execution chamber and was sat upon the electric chair. The executioner, Edwin F. Davis, cut a slit in her dress and then placed the electrode on her ankle before final checks were made, then the electric chair was turned on. It was said by witnesses that Martha died instantly on the electric chair and that there was very little struggle. She was not actually the first woman to be sentenced to death to die by the electric chair, as serial killer Lizzie Halliday and Maria Barbella were sentenced to death with the device, but it was Martha Place whose sentence was carried out first. Following her death, she was buried in a family plot in New Jersey. But Martha M. Place has gone down in history as the first woman to be executed using the electric chair. She was a woman who callously murdered her stepdaughter and who had caused a number of violent problems for her husband, but there may have been something deeper causing her instability and violent tempers and outbursts. It seems that the accident she had when she was 23, involving the sledge, was not ideal and could have caused her a degree of problems which may have altered her mental state, and she may have suffered from some form of brain injury. However, at the age of 49, she was taken into the execution chamber for the horrific murder of a young 17-year-old girl. Fanny Kaplan was born on the 10th of February 1890, and very little is known about her early life and background. She was born into a Jewish family, and her father was a teacher, and she had 7 brothers and sisters. She was sometimes referred to as Dora, and she was educated at home, and she then left home to work as a milliner in Odessa. She then became part of the Socialist Revolutionaries, and joined a socialist group, becoming a revolutionary. But in 1906, at the age of 16, she was arrested in Kiev. There had been a terrorist bomb plot in the Ukrainian city, and she was captured after a bomb her and her partner were working on exploded accidentally. But because of this, she was sentenced to life inside of a hard labour prison camp, and she was held in a number of prisons in Siberia, and she then lost her sight. This would come back, but she was released on the 3rd of March 1917, following the February Revolution, which destabilised the imperial government. However, because of the horrific treatment she was subjected to, Kaplan suffered from headaches and migraines throughout her life, and throughout periods in it, she would go blind. But around 1917, she would lose heart and motivation with Lenin, and there was conflict between the social revolutionaries and also the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks had strong support, but they failed to win a majority in the November 1917 elections, and a socialist revolutionary was elected president in the following January. The Bolsheviks, supporting the Soviets, ordered for the Constituent Assembly to be closed down, and then the Bolsheviks began to ban other influential political parties, including the one Fanny Kaplan supported. They turned on their socialist revolutionary allies, who had been their main coalition partner for some time, but then Kaplan began to work out how she could assassinate Lenin, as she thought he was now a traitor to the revolution. On the 30th of August 1918, Lenin spoke at the Hammer and Sickle, which was a weapons factory in southern Moscow. But he did not know that there that day was a young woman who was planning to assassinate him. Fanny Kaplan was there, near to the exit of the building, and as Lenin left the building and walked towards his car, Kaplan shouted out to him. She called out his name, and Lenin turned towards her, and Fanny Kaplan then fired 3 shots at Lenin from her Browning pistol. One of these bullets passed through his coat, and the other 2 hit him. One went through his neck and punctured part of his left lung, and the bullet then stopped near his right collarbone. The other bullet was lodged in his left shoulder. Quickly Lenin was taken away, and he was escorted to his living quarters at the Kremlin, and he became very paranoid that more assassins were waiting for him. He believed that the hospitals were too dangerous for him, and he said he would not leave the Kremlin, and he ordered that doctors should be brought to him to treat him. But this left him with a serious problem, as Lenin needed to be in hospital to remove the bullet, and they had to leave these in, as he refused to go to a medical facility. But Vladimir Lenin managed to survive the attack. However, his health would never recover, and it's believed that the effects of the shooting led to his strokes that left him in later life so incapacitated. These eventually killed him, so if these bullets did cause the strokes, then chances are that Fanny Kaplan's assassination attempt could have been considered successful. There are a number of stories relating to her capture. One is that following the 3 shots being fired, a woman who looked suspicious was detained, and this turned out to be Kaplan. But another account said she was arrested after several children identified her. During her interrogation she said, "My name is Fanny Kaplan. Today I shot Lenin. I did it on my own. I will not say from whom I obtained my revolver. I will give no details. I'd resolved to kill Lenin long ago. I consider him a traitor to the revolution. I was exiled to Akatui for participating in an assassination attempt against a Tsarist official in Kiev. I spent 11 years at hard labour. After the revolution I was freed. I favour the Constituent Assembly and am still for it." And she would never turn over any accomplices. A military commander would later turn state's evidence against her and said that Kaplan had become a member of a socialist revolutionary plot to kill Lenin, and that she was regarded as the best person to carry out the attack. It was suggested in the years after that she was working with other people, and as she was nearly blind, someone else would have needed to help her. None of the witnesses also saw her specifically fire the gun, and it's believed that many suspects were arrested. Interestingly also, the bullet removed from Lenning's neck after his death was found to have been fired from a weapon that may have been different to the one that Kaplan had. However, as she would not give over any accomplices, Fanny Kaplan was marked as a lost cause, and the Soviets had no other option than to order her execution, they believed. In Alexander Garden, Kaplan was led out, and there the commander of the Kremlin, a former Baltic sailor, P.D. Malkov, and a group of Latvian Bolsheviks executed her. On the 3rd of September 1918, she was met by her executioners, and they then shot her directly in the back of the head. Following this, they stuffed her body into a barrel, and then set this on fire. Yakov Sverdlov had been the one that gave this order, and he was the same man who had ordered the execution of the Tsar and his family. Her remains were completely destroyed, and there were rumours that she did survive in a Siberian labour camp, but this was not the case, and she succumbed to a horrific death. Fanny Kaplan was just 28 when she was executed inside of a park by government officials. She was a woman who suffered following her imprisonment earlier, and she did experience blindness. There has been much debate about her role in the execution, and many believe that she would not have been capable to shoot Lenin due to her eyesight. But Lenin, after the assassination attempt, would live, but his health following this would never be the same, and he would suffer with his health until the day he died. Born on the 2nd of November 1755 in Vienna, Austria, Maria Antonia was the youngest daughter of the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, Empress Maria Theresa, and her husband Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. It was clear that she was destined to live a lavish lifestyle, and she spent her early years living in the royal Austrian palaces. She was well educated, however teachers commented on her lack of aptitude for learning, and she was rather poor at writing in different languages, and was also poor at speaking different languages. For princesses, mastering different languages was extremely important, as the hope was that they would marry a prince or king from a different country to forge alliances, and this did not stand Maria in good stead. She was a talented musician preferring more practical things than the academic, and it was said that her heart and character were excellent. In February 1770, Louis XV of France requested the hand of Maria for a match with his oldest surviving grandson, Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France. This was accepted to seal an alliance between the nations, and the Dauphin and Maria became engaged and then married by proxy. She met her husband on the 14th of May 1770 at Versailles, and there was a mixed reaction to the marriage. Marie initially was liked by the French people, but some did oppose the alliance with Austria. Following the death of Louis XV, the Dauphin became King Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette became the Queen of France. She initially had little influence over her husband, but received extremely lavish gifts from the king. Allegedly, one chateau she was gifted was renovated with the walls covered in diamonds and gold, and she continued to spend extremely heavily on luxuries. At the time, France was suffering greatly from financial problems, and the people of France were in great hardship, with many being even unable to buy bread for their family. Because of this, many poor people were dying, but in the face of this, Marie the Queen kept spending huge sums of money on her dresses, hairstyles, luxuries and furniture. There were riots in France, and she began to become a figure of hatred, even being blamed for the economic crisis. Everyone could see what she was doing, but Marie ignored it. Her husband Louis was also suffering. A number of blunders had lent him poorly to the French population. The couple did have children, but problems in France still remained. There was a celebration, especially with the birth of the Dauphin, but Marie also became involved in European politics. At court she promoted her favourites, and it's alleged had affairs with high-up members of society, but leaflets about the Queen's sexual deviance emerged across France. Allegations of the Queen having affairs and illicit behaviour was levelled against her, including accusations of affairs with women. With this, her mother feared for her daughter's safety, but things continued, spending large amounts of money, buying property and living the high life. More allegations emerged too regarding her lifestyle, with some levelling accusations of illegitimacy against her second-born son. With Marie willing to become involved in politics, she wanted to improve her image. The diamond necklace affair occurred, which was a scandal at court, in which part of France's most valuable jewellery was virtually stolen. Tricks emerged and it was levelled that Marie Antoinette's name was linked to the swindling of the jewellery, and this further enhanced Marie's negative reputation, despite her lack of involvement. Louis XVI often asked Marie for advice on politics, but there was a situation brewing between the Assembly and the King. But the major factor in the revolution was the financial problems in France. This was due to a number of expensive wars Louis took part in, a royal family who spent heavily, an unwillingness from the higher-up members of society to help out the lower classes. Marie became a target of disgrace, and when the revolution broke out, it had devastating consequences for the king and queen. The revolution in France had a number of key events that saw the monarchy overthrown. The storming of the Bastille was a sign of the king's decreasing power, and how the people could rise up and overthrow the monarchy, and the anger they had towards Louis and Marie, and the desperation spurred on the revolt. The revolution even forced the royal family to move out of their palace, and European powers sought to try and find a way for the French royal family to escape the anarchy. Several plots were drawn up, but the Queen rejected them, as she refused to leave without Louis, her husband. The royal family found themselves imprisoned, and on the 21st of September 1792, the National Assembly declared France a republic. Previously, an angry mob had broken into the French royal palace and insulted Marie and threatened to kill her, and there was bloodshed inside of the palace. With the declaration of the Republic, Louis was placed on trial and was sentenced to death on the 15th of January 1793. He was then 6 days later executed by guillotine in front of a huge crowd in Paris. The Queen, now a widow, was in great mourning. She hoped that one day her son would become king, however was a prisoner to the French people. Whilst imprisoned at the Tower of the Temple, she along with her children were insulted and kept under strict watch to ensure she could not communicate with the outside. Marie's fate after Louis's execution became a big question, with debate occurring as what to do with her. Others wished to have her executed, but some wanted her exchanging in a swap for French prisoners of war, or even sending to America. Decisions were made to retrain her son, the 8-year-old Dauphin, in the ways of the revolution, and Marie was transferred from the Temple to a small cell in the conciergerie. She was kept under constant watch and was given no privacy during this time. She was brought to trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal on the 14th of October 1793, and it's thought that the outcome had already been decided that she would be put to death. She faced a number of different charges, financial ones, ones regarding her relationships, and even planning massacres. She was even accused of incest, but little could be done, and she was found guilty of 3 main charges: of the depletion of the national treasury, of conspiracy against the security of the state, and of high treason, and for this she was sentenced to death. She believed the worst she would get would be imprisonment, so the death sentence came at a shock. In her final days she wrote to her sister-in-law, expressing her love for her children and her devotion to Catholicism, and her will was made. In preparation for her execution, she was forced to change her clothes in front of the guards. She was forced to wear a plain white dress, although wished to wear a black one. Her hair was cut short against her wishes to ensure that the guillotine took her life without any issue. As she was taken out of her cell, she was bound with her hands tied behind her back, painfully hurting the former Queen of France. Marie was then placed on a rope lead and taken to her carriage. She was taken to her execution on an open cart, with it taking an hour to arrive at the Place de la Révolution. The crowds would have lined the streets as the slow cart moved throughout the city of Paris, and when she arrived at her execution site, the guillotine stood ready for her. At around 12:15 p.m. on the 16th of October 1793, Marie Antoinette stepped onto the scaffold to greet Charles Henry Sanson, a notorious executioner who took her husband's head 10 months before. He was stood in a black mask and probably never dreamed of the fact he would execute the Queen of France. As she approached the executioner, she stood accidentally on Sanson's foot and said, "Pardon me, sir, I didn't mean to." Whilst on the scaffold it was said she maintained her composure, but the crowd hurled insults and jeers at her. A priest accompanied her, and everything was ready for the Queen's execution. Minutes after she made her way onto the scaffold, she was placed onto the guillotine. Marie Antoinette's execution was remarkably swift, as was common with the guillotine, and her head was taken clean off by the blade. She would have been placed onto the board, then slid under the blade before it fell, and within seconds her head was taken clean off. Her head was then held up to the crowd, and Sanson proclaimed to the roaring crowd, "Vive la République!" Marie Antoinette's remains were then taken to a graveyard behind the Church de Medellin, around a half a mile away. The gravediggers were on a lunch break, which allowed Madame Tussaud to take a wax imprint of her face before she was then placed in an unmarked grave. Decades later her body was exhumed and she was given a proper burial, and it was said that some of her white hair remained on her skeleton. Marie Antoinette was a very divisive figure in France, and the vast majority of the French population greatly disliked her for her lavish spending, all whilst the French were struggling to buy loaves of bread. She was a figure of the monarchy in France and became a controversial figure of the French Revolution. Some see her as a scapegoat, but what cannot be excused is the expense she spent on nonsense during her time as queen, gambling away thousands whilst everyone was suffering. Without Marie, there most probably would not have been a revolution in France.
Joan Waste was born around 1534 in Derby, the city where she would spend all of her life and where she would be killed. She was born blind and was a twin, and her father was a barber inside the city. She was named after her mother, but at the age of 12, despite being unable to see, she had managed to somehow master how to knit very well, and also she worked with her father as a rope maker, and became rather skilled at this. But when Joan was 19, her whole life would be uprooted and changed. Mary I came onto the throne, and many people across England feared the changes she would bring. The Catholic Mary restored Catholicism as England's religion, and also outlawed Protestantism, and made it illegal to hold these beliefs. As mentioned, at least 284 people who were Protestant, including the former Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer, and Bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, were burned at the stake and were seen as heretics. Religious crimes were considered the worst evils in the Tudor period, and they were dealt with very brutally. Some were offered the chance to recant, but decided to go to the stake and die a man or woman of their principles. Mary I was struggling at the time to conceive a child and also give birth to one, and following a phantom pregnancy which disappointed many in England, she believed she was being punished by God. Mary believed that God would not grant her a child until she instigated harsher punishments on religious criminals and Protestants, and further people were burned at the stake. In some places and towns, numerous people were burned on the same fire, and these scenes in particular haunted the people who watched public executions during the Tudor times. To see someone or many people burning in front of your eyes would have been truly horrific. Joan Waste held Protestant beliefs, and despite the fact she was disabled and could not see, the whole law book was thrown at her. She was called before a Catholic tribunal, made up of the Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry, Ralph Baines, and Chancellor Anthony Draycott. During this trial, she was asked to explain herself and her religious beliefs, and also to defend herself. But the judges were not satisfied with the answers she gave, and she spoke out, simply telling people what she believed. She believed that the Protestant way was the right way, and she refused to accept the church services, which were now being reverted back to Latin, a language very few people across the nation could understand. She viewed the English Protestant services as much more rewarding, and with this protested against Mary I's beliefs. She had also brought a New Testament, which had been translated into English, and she asked her many friends, as she could not see, to read it for her. Joan would then pay them a penny each time for doing this, and she also denied that the bread and wine could be changed into the body and the blood of Christ, which was a Catholic belief. Joan Waste's trial took place in All Saints Parish Church, which has today been rebuilt, and is today known as Derby Cathedral. But for her crimes she was sentenced to death. It was to be burning at the stake for Joan, like a number of others across the nation. Today, holding different religious beliefs is no issue, but during the 16th century it was a huge crime and offence. On the 1st of August 1556, she was to be executed, and on the day of her death she walked with her twin brother, and he held her hand and guided her as she walked towards her death ordeal. First she was accompanied to church by Anthony Draycott, who gave a final sermon for her life, along with other prominent priests. It was said Draycott stated, "This woman is condemned for denying the sacrament of the altar, to be the very body and blood of Christ, really and substantially, and is for this reason cut off from the body of the Catholic Church." Dr. Draycott began and went on to say that she is not only blind in her bodily eyes, but also blind in the eyes of her soul, and as her body will soon be consumed with material fire, so her soul will be burned in hell with everlasting fire, as soon as it is separated from her body. There it will remain, world without end. He then forbade everybody to pray for her, issuing many terrible threats against anyone that dared to do so, and finally he then gave the order to burn Joan Waste to death. Her execution was to take place at Windmill Pit on Burton Road in Derby. It was said that Joan desired the people to pray for her, and said such prayers as she had learned, and cried upon Christ to have mercy upon her. As long as life served Dr. Draycott, he went to his inn, and there laid down, and he slept during all the time of her execution. So the very man who sentenced her to death could not bear to witness the proceedings of the blind lady burning. Joan was to be burned alive, however she was also to be hanged over the fire with a rope, which was intended to kill her, and then she would be burned dead on the fire. But this did not go well. As Joan was hanged over the fire, and the noose was around her neck, the flames rose higher, to the point where the rope burned through and she fell into the blazing inferno. It would have been a harrowing sight for people to have seen and smelt, and Joan was expected to suffer for her beliefs and be damned for eternity. Burning at the stake was incredibly tough, as it would take a number of minutes for someone to succumb to their fate, and there were many chances for it to have gone wrong. But on the fire there inside of Derby, she was burned alive. Today there are a number of memorials to Joan Waste, and ironically the place where she was executed now marks the site of a Roman Catholic church that possessed the very beliefs and ideas that condemned Joan Waste to death. Later the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, who ordered her execution, was sacked when Elizabeth I came onto the throne, and he was then sent to prison by the Bishop of London. Draycott, who also ordered the killing, was a prisoner of the Fleet Prison in London, and he then died in 1571. But the story and execution of Joan Waste was an incredibly tragic and harrowing one, in which a blind woman of around 22 years of age was burned alive. She was not old at all when she made her way to her death, and she was a talented and skilled woman who made the best of the life she had. She was a skilled rope maker, and despite being blind, created a good reputation for herself in her local area. But ultimately she encountered problems with regards to her religious views, and she was just one of many who were executed during the short 5-year reign of Bloody Mary for holding different religious beliefs. Her story today is one that is often forgotten, but it definitely deserves to be told.
Anne Askew was born around the year 1521, and her father was a gentleman inside of Henry VIII's court, and he was also a juror when a number of men found themselves accused of treason and adultery with Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn. He was known to the king, but the Askew family were also related to Robert Aske, the leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was a large protest that arose in the north of England against the king's changes to the church. But Anne Askew then married Thomas Kyne, and she was a very strict Protestant at a time when this attracted some suspicion, despite the changes the king was making to the church. Anne Askew began to preach inside of towns and cities, including in Lincoln. She spent a lot of time reading the Bible. However, her husband was a Catholic, and he ended up throwing her out for her views. Anne may have even visited the king to try and ask for a divorce, and at the time many suspected her of being a spy, and she was actually placed under surveillance. Anne then began to preach in London, and she spoke about her Protestant ideas and beliefs, and this caused her to be arrested a number of times, and she was imprisoned for these. But in March 1545 she was arrested on suspicion of heresy and religious crimes, and this was at the time punishable by death. Anne was questioned about a heretical book she had on her possession, and the writer of this had been burned at the stake over 10 years earlier. However, Anne was then interrogated by Bishop Bonner, who was actually known as Bloody Bonner, the infamous Bishop of London, who was notorious for torturing prisoners and suspected heretics. Anne eventually signed a confession and was released from prison 2 weeks later, and she was then returned to Lincoln. But Anne Askew was later hunted by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who was trying to get rid of radical Protestants, and Anne Askew was then, by permission of the king, scheduled to be arrested. Anne was selected as it was believed she was close with Catherine Parr, the sixth wife of Henry VIII, who possessed herself very radical religious views. Catherine's beliefs led to a significant amount of suspicion on her, and laws were even passed to prevent women from reading the Bible and from writing scripture. Bishop Gardiner thought that Catherine Parr was trying to undermine the king's beliefs, and thus change the religious rules of England. Because of this, Anne Askew was arrested. She was then sent to the Tower of London, but she would not name any other rebellious Protestants. She was imprisoned inside of the Tower, and Sir Anthony Kingston, the constable of the Tower, was told to torture her in an attempt to get her to implicate the king's sixth wife and other heretics. Kingston was not comfortable with the idea of torturing a woman, like he had been told to do so, and this was illegal across England. However, the Lord Chancellor Thomas Risley and his assistant Richard Rich then seized control of the rack. Anne Askew was tied to the rack, the horrific stretching device, and she refused to give over the names of any Protestants and her friends. Because of this, the Lord Chancellor and Rich then began to operate the rack and turn it to stretch Anne, and her ordeal was horrific. It was said by Anne herself that, "They put me on the rack, because I confess no ladies or gentlemen to be of my opinion. The Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took great pains to rack me with their own hands, till I was nearly dead. I fainted, and then they recovered me again. After that I sat 2 long hours arguing with the Lord Chancellor upon the bare floor. With many flattering words he tried to persuade me to leave my opinion. I said I would rather die than break my faith." Anne Askew was a broken woman, and she had been racked to within an inch of her life, and her limbs had been dislocated, and she was screaming in agony. The questioning and interrogation continued. She was then taken away to gather herself. She was then asked to abandon her faith. Anne continued to refuse this, and she was then sent to Newgate Prison to await her execution. She had been brutalised by some of Henry VIII's most senior men in government, and on the 16th of July 1546, Anne Askew was taken to Smithfield, and she was to be burned at the stake as a heretic. Burning was a common punishment for heretics, and this persecution would continue during the reign of Bloody Mary, Henry VIII's daughter. But Smithfield was a place which became known for burnings, and it was a site where screams would regularly be heard of those being tied to the stake for their execution on busy market days. Anne was carried to her execution on a chair, as she could not walk, and it was said she was still crippled by her tortures, and she screamed as the men carried her to the execution post. She was fastened to a modified stake, as a seat had to be placed for her to sit on, as she could not walk due to the racking. She was then chained to the stake and was bound by her ankles, knees, waist, chest and neck, and there was nowhere for her to escape. The executioner then tied a small bag of gunpowder around her neck, meaning that her ordeal would not be prolonged. Anne Askew was burned alongside 3 other men, and the fire was lit, and Anne Askew succumbed to it. A large crowd watched as she died alongside the others, but after the execution of Anne Askew, Henry VIII would sympathise with his wife Catherine Parr's religious beliefs, and things between the ruling pair got much better. Henry VIII by this time did not have long left to live, and he tolerated his wife's different beliefs on religion, and she did look after him rather well. But Anne Askew's story was later written about in Fox's Book of Martyrs, and many around the world learned of her suffering. She is today remembered as the only woman on record who was tortured inside of the Tower of London, and her story is one which shows the cruelty of Henry VIII's officers and government. But Anne was a remarkable woman who stayed true to her beliefs and faith, and she believed her religion was the right way. But for this she was racked inside of the tower and was burned at the stake a short distance away from it. Ruth Nielsen, as she was born on the 9th of October 1926, was the 5th of 6 children. Her father, Arthur, began to be abusive towards her, and despite being questioned by the police many times, no formal charges were brought against him. Ruth worked as an usherette in a cinema during her teenage years, and she took different jobs before she moved to London, where the abuse continued by her father. But when she was 17, she became pregnant by a married Canadian soldier. She gave birth to a son, but then suffered financially after the soldier stopped sending money for her. By the end of the 1940s, Ruth was working as a nightclub hostess in the bustling London scene, and she worked as a nude model. but she then married a divorced dentist named George Johnson Ellis, and he was a violent alcoholic, and he treated Ruth awfully yet again. She then became, in 1953, the manager of the Little Club, a nightclub in Knightsbridge, and she had many celebrity friends and admirers, and it was here where she met David Blakely, a racing driver. The couple had a fast relationship, and within weeks he moved into Ruth's flat, despite the fact he was already engaged. But then Ruth also began to see a former RAF pilot named Desmond Cousins, who during World War II had flown Lancaster bombers. Ruth then moved in with him close to Oxford Street, but she continued to see David Blakely. Blakely offered to marry Ruth, but the couple then had a row, which resulted in Blakely punching Ruth in the stomach, causing a miscarriage in January 1955. On the 10th of April 1955, Ruth Ellis took a cab from Cousins' home to the home of one of Blakely's friends, and as she got there his car drove off. She then walked to the Mandala pub in the South Hill Park, where David's car was parked outside. She waited, and at 9:30 p.m, David Blakely came out of the pub, and he passed Ruth on the pavement, and she pulled out a revolver, and she fired 5 shots at Blakely. The first shot missed, and Ruth continued to fire, with the second round hitting and causing him to collapse. She then shot 3 more bullets as he lay on the ground, and one was fired less than half an inch from his back. One bystander who saw this was injured, as one bullet ricocheted and hit her hand. Ruth stood in shock over his body, and asked someone to call the police, and she was then immediately arrested, and she then claimed, "I am guilty. I'm a little confused." There was nothing that could be done to save David Blakely. He was dead. She was questioned at Hampstead Police Station, and Ruth appeared calm, and she was not under the influence of alcohol or anything else, and the following day she was brought in front of the magistrates, and she was then held on remand. She was medically examined for mental illness, but nothing could be found, and with this a decision was then brought forward to months later try her in front of the Old Bailey. The story of Ruth Ellis captivated Britain, and on the 20th of June 1955 she appeared in No. 1 Court in front of Mr. Justice Havers. She wore a black suit and a white silk blouse, and seemed very glamorous, and her trial was over very quickly. There was only one question put to her by the prosecution, and this was, "When you fired the revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do?" Ruth replied with, "It's obvious when I shot him, I intended to kill him." With this she was deemed guilty, and she was given the mandatory death sentence, with just 20 minutes needed by jury to convict her. Inside of Holloway Prison, Ruth Ellis waited her date with the executioner. She met with her mother and claimed she didn't want a petition to reprieve her, but a campaign was launched to try and get the Home Secretary to pardon her, or at least commute her sentence from death to imprisonment. This was denied, but on the 12th of July 1955, the day before her execution, Ruth wanted to make her will. She promised to provide her lawyers with the full story as to what happened, and Ruth claimed that the gun had been given to her by the former RAF pilot Cousins that she was seeing, and that he had driven her to the scene where she then murdered Blakely. But this evidence, it later claimed, made Ruth more dangerous, and was further evidence of premeditation, showing that the death had previously been planned. It was also said by the Home Secretary in this case that, "We cannot have people shooting off firearms in the streets. As long as I was Home Secretary, I was determined to ensure that people could use the streets without fear of a bullet." Ruth wrote a final letter to the victims' parents claiming, "I have always loved your son, and I shall die loving him." Shortly before her execution, Ruth Ellis was visited by the Bishop of Stepney, who gave her religious counsel. She had spent just 3 weeks and 2 days on death row, inside the condemned suite at Holloway Prison. In the days before, she had been weighed at 103 pounds, clothed, and the executioner Albert Pierpoint calculated a drop of 8 feet 4 inches needed to snap her neck. The gallows had been previously tested using a sandbag of the same weight, and at 7 a.m. on the morning of the execution, the trapdoor was reset for her. A cross had been placed on the wall of the execution room, as per her final request. On the 13th of July 1955, just before 9 a.m, Ruth Ellis was given a final glass of brandy to steady her nerves, and at 8:55 a.m. a call was actually made to Holloway Prison from someone claiming to be the Home Office, but this was found to have been a hoax rather than a convenient stay of execution. The decision was made to proceed with Ruth's execution. At 9:01 a.m, Albert Pierpoint entered her prison cell, pinioned her hands behind her back with a leather strap, and he took her the short 15 feet to the gallows in the adjoining room. He was helped by a male prison guard, who held her elbows. Pierpoint claimed that Ruth said nothing at all, but that she did smile at the executioner before he did his work. When she got to the trapdoor, a white cotton hood was thrown over her head, and Pierpoint then adjusted the noose around her neck. His assistant secured her legs with a leather strap, and then everyone stepped back, and Pierpoint then released the trapdoor, and in the space of around 15 seconds from entering the execution chamber, Ruth Ellis had been sent crashing through the gallows. Her body was left for an hour, as was customary, before a doctor confirmed that death had indeed taken place. Outside the prison gates, a huge crowd of around 1,000 people, including women with pushchairs, prayed for Ruth Ellis, and at 9:18 a.m, the execution notice was pinned onto the gates of the prison, confirming that indeed Ruth Ellis was dead. Her autopsy was performed, and it was found she had died instantaneously, showing Pierpoint calculated the drop correctly. The execution of Ruth Ellis was incredibly controversial. The 28-year-old former nightclub hostess is seen today by many as a victim of abuse on an unprecedented scale by many male figures in her life who seemingly took advantage and inflicted horrific evil upon her. There was a significant amount of condemnation about her execution, and it led to many people beginning to question the use of capital punishment, but today Ruth Ellis is remembered as the final woman to be executed in the UK. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.